Bryan, what's up? We're live.
Hey Shane, how you doing?
You're tuning in from the studio.
That's right. We're here live at the studio.
How's the studio going today? A lot of samples flying around.
It's good, just getting going for the morning, and wanted to talk through what we're doing on this on these videos of ours to try and give people some understanding and hopefully something that they can use for their own brands and packaging.
So yeah, I mean, we've been working together a couple of months just on this particular concept, and I'm pretty excited about it. I think what we've landed on is really cool and going to be really valuable for people. So I think the point of this video is to talk about why we're doing that, and then also discuss the scoring algorithm that we came up with, because I think that scoring criteria is pretty cool and going to be pretty helpful to rank a lot of these different packaging options that we're reviewing. So I think, let's maybe talk about why behind the concept and the goal behind the concept, and then we can pivot over and discuss the scoring algorithm. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Let's do that. This scoring concept is pretty exciting for us, actually. It's something we've been thinking about, even though we say we're talking about it for a couple months, something we've been thinking about for years, actually, just because there's so much conversation about, especially when clients come to us of what's going to make my packaging good, what's going to make it better. And it's easy to look at something and give an opinion on it, but it's more difficult to come back and give real strategic, meaningful criticism to something that's actually going to be meaningful to your business too. So this is a way for us to kind of sum up a lot of what we know and put it into very easy to digest and understand categories that you can apply to what you're doing. Basically, we're really excited about it because it says so much about what we're doing.
Totally. Yeah. And I think going back to the original concept of the packaging list and these discussions that we're having and reviewing, in a sense, kind of reviewing other people's product, doing unboxings, but, reviewing and breaking them down. What I love about the overall concept is I remember when I was doing my first set of packaging, and I spent like 3 hours. We were in a hotel lobby. I was with Thomas, and we were going through and kind of strategizing about packaging. And it was the first time I really understood that packaging doesn't just come out of nowhere. You have to be intentional and design kind of each part of it. And so I remember one of the most impactful things from that discussion was he was saying, hey, you should just go buy a bunch of different stuff and start piecing it together and almost make a prototype of it. And I hadn't really wrapped my head around the fact of oh yeah, you can take what somebody else is doing and what somebody else is doing and what this person's doing and kind of put it together into one overall concept. I thought that was pretty cool. So I feel like this series we're doing, breaking down different parts, breaking down materials and pricing, I love it because I wish I would have had that when I first started making product and packaging, to be able to say, hey, here's some good references you can pull, and here's some different techniques you can try and some different angles and shapes and materials. That's what kind of excites me about the overall flow of it, just thinking in the mind of an entrepreneur and a product creator. Tell me what you love about the concept when it comes to working with clients and design. You see so many samples every single week from different clients we're working with and products we're making. So how do you feel like this would serve the clients that we're working with now?
I think what's interesting working with so many different types of brands and clients and products is that the need and the outcome of the actual packaging is going to vary so much, which is obvious in some sense, right? When we look at packaging a phone case versus some jewelry, you're going to have a much different need in terms of its retail presence, the expectation from the consumer, what you're trying to achieve in terms of just overall brand and impact and opening experience. So we see it all. But what's interesting is the same criteria are applied to all of these different brands. It's really where your emphasis is depending on your goals. So some of it may be really about structural. Like we're doing candle packaging right now for something that weighs 3 pounds. Something like that is going to have a much different requirement than a simple article of clothing or something that weighs 10 grams or something, right? So there's that side of it, but still you have to figure out the structure regardless. But the structure is going to be so much more critical to that brand and product being successful, because if the product arrives and is damaged or just presents poorly, then you've kind of failed, right?
Yeah, you're speaking to something I personally love too, because I feel like this is one of the core strengths of process where, a lot of people can sit down and concept and throw ideas around, and it's pretty easy to come in and say, hey, your packaging would be a lot more engaging if it, had a custom glass front. And when you open it, there's magnets and then there's steam that came out when the product, when you pulled, like it's, a lot of people focus on that of like coming up with these wacky concepts, but then actually making that into reality is pretty tough. It's not really about the idea a lot of times as much as it is about how are we actually going to execute this and deliver it. And to your point, what if it looks great when it leaves the factory, but it rattles around on a container or air freight or Amazon, and then it shows up to the customer and it's broken. So I feel like that's probably one of the core strengths with process is being able to take really awesome ideas, but then actually make them executable and something that you can actually deliver to your client.
That's a good point, and I'm glad you brought it up because we often talk about that, and we often get comments on it as well. That hey, I worked with this design firm. They did a great job. It looks great, but we couldn't produce it because the files weren't set up correctly. It was too expensive. Like their concepts were really cool, but we couldn't afford it. So we're really looking at the whole gamut of everything needed to get that done. So we are from the very beginning looking at budgets, looking at timelines, looking at your goals, right? Of like what you're trying to achieve with the customer, looking at where this package is going to go. Is this going directly to the consumer? Is it going on a retail shelf? Is it some sort of presentation? Is it with other packages? All of that stuff is considered. And
Totally.
that's, ultimately a successful packaging is taking all those things into consideration and kind of making the best of them. And, coming back to our scoring and what we decided our categories are going to be, I think are pretty reflective of that kind of rounded approach to how we do this.
Yeah. So on that note, we'll get into this when we talk about, some of the different scoring criteria, but I think it is important enough. It's probably nice to underline as a separate idea. But I feel like it's important to emphasize that the way we work with clients is not primarily cost-based. Would you say that's correct? Like our ideal client isn't, Johnson & Johnson coming in saying, hey, we have this Band-Aid packaging for 12 cents and we need to get it for 11.2 cents. And we need you to figure out how to shave half a penny off this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's always, a part of it, right? I mean, at some point, cost is always a factor, but at the same time, more often what we're doing is we're finding packaging designs and concepts that are elevating the experience and often allowing the products to sell at a higher price or just sell through, basically.
Yeah. So it's almost like the goal might not be, a client might say, hey, I want to get costs down on this. But in reality, the right move for them might actually be, hey, let's spend 5X on this packaging because that's going to inflate, your perceived retail by X, Y, Z or the shareability of it or something like that. So it feels like, and not that we're trying to come in and make everyone's packaging more expensive, but it feels like that's a nice strategic servicing that we offer, right? Of saying, hey, here's where you could make strategic investments that are actually going to have a return on the back end instead of just looking at it from a spreadsheet of saying, hey, let's drive the bill of materials down as low as you can.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Shane. A lot of times what this is about is really looking at your packaging, knowing that you have to spend something on some type of container to put your product in, but looking at that as an opportunity to really get more out of your product and your experience with your customers, to really build some brand relevance and some value into your product. Done right, anytime you're adding any sort of element from basic printing to trim or anything special to your packaging, obviously it's going to add a little bit of cost. But at the end of the day, in terms of your overall marketing spend, it's actually usually a pretty small part of what you're spending for your company, but has a tremendous impact. So we really look at it in terms of like, what value are you getting when you're looking at the packaging design itself, and how is that going to impact your company?
I love that because that really is the reality of how packaging does affect marketing budgets, right? And it affects shareability and virality and that kind of thing. And so I'm thinking, when you're saying that, I'm thinking of like Quip that we reviewed. And it's like, yeah, compared to other toothbrushes, they probably overspent on packaging, which we'll get to when we talk bang for your buck. But, it's like, what's the return they're getting like just the perception of, wow, this is a really premium brand, or people wanting to share it. You always mention to me, like, if you gave this to your father-in-law, would he be excited and feel like he got a cool gift, or would he be like, oh, great, thanks for here's something that's going to sit on my shelf. So I think it's like, I love what you're saying. And it's like remembering that there's an ROI to it. It's not just a one for one, hey, let's spend this or let's not spend Y. There's an ROI to it of, hey, can this be more shareable? Can this sell, have more features? Can it, kind of do its job on the shelf, things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, should we actually jump in and go through some of these criteria? Because I feel like these 5 we came up with are pretty awesome.
Yeah, let's jump into them. I think they kind of speak for themselves.
Okay, so the 5 criteria we came up with, and I feel like these 5 match pretty well to how you would work with a client as far as, auditing their current packaging or the goals we would try to hit for them on new packaging. But the 5 we came up with are bang for your buck, effectiveness, defendability, execution, and sustainability. And then each of those criteria are weighted a bit. So it's not a one for one. In our model, for example, effectiveness is worth more on our scoring model than sustainability, for example. So let's just go through each one of those in detail.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's start with bang for your buck. So what is bang for your buck, and why is it important to consider in your packaging?
Bang for your buck is maybe one of the more obvious one, because when you are developing your packaging, it's always a cost of good that you have to consider with your product, right?
Yeah.
When you're doing that, you are just essentially, trying to get as much out of that packaging as you can for the dollar you're spending. That being said, what does it really mean to be good value, and how do you determine, what is the best spend for your packaging for your product? We can give examples of different products. We've done a lot of cell phone cases, and it's surprising to most people that the packaging is typically much more expensive for cell phone cases than the actual product itself.
Yeah.
You gotta think like the product is just a single piece of plastic that's injection molded. Sometimes it could be 20 cents or something like that. The packaging is sometimes multiples of dollars, because of that specific industry. There is such a large amount of brands within it, all competing on the shelf. Packaging is one of the few ways that they can really differentiate themselves and make an impact with the consumer. And so the market has kind of driven the cost of that packaging higher than the product itself.
It's almost like a placebo effect. Maybe not with a more expensive product like an iPhone, but you take an iPhone case, and for sure the presentation is going to affect what your perception of the quality of the case, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And which will get kind of into our other categories of, what the actual effectiveness of the packaging is. But, in terms of bang for your buck specifically, what we try to do, if we broke this down, we would really be looking at what the product is specifically, what the market looks like, meaning like what does all of the competition within the market look like, how this is being presented. Is this going on a retail shelf? Is this going into the mail? What are the different components that need to be included in this? And, is the customer or the brand producing something, an experience or an additional item that is increasing the overall value beyond what the product would be by itself? So I think all of those factors kind of come in. So even though it's a simple one to describe and understand in some sense, there is a lot of factors that go into kind of really, getting a real high ratio on your bang for your buck, I think.
And I think something to underline too that you've talked a lot about is that bang for your buck isn't related to price so much. So this is probably a drastic example, but you could have a company spending 99 cents for their packaging, and on our score they would get a huge bang for your buck. They're really getting a high return for that 99 cents. You could have another company that's spending $99 and maybe they totally miss the mark and they're getting a really low return for that investment, right? So it's not really about investment at the end of the day. It's more about the return on how well did they do with that money invested for packaging. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's more about what you're doing with that spend to create, meaningful impact.
Love that. Let's talk effectiveness, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the weights on each of these scores. But let's talk about effectiveness. What does effectiveness mean in when you're looking at a product, and what are some of the things that you look at that make you say, oh, hey, this is pretty effective, or no, they kind of missed the mark here, not so effective?
Effectiveness is an important one for us, and maybe a more difficult one to describe. But essentially, this is how we're judging how well this packaging is doing in terms of its core job. We often describe packaging as the silent salesman because it's really the presentation of your product and kind of making that final sell to the consumer in a retail setting. But even in a different scenario like direct to consumer, it is, convincing the consumer that what they purchased is of, the value or more value than they expected sometimes. So it's definitely doing a job, and we're kind of rating how good of a job it's doing, which is what we're calling effectiveness. Is it effectively selling and communicating the right things about your product that you want to the consumer, which could be, sales focused. It could be more communication on how to use the product, so less frustration, lower returns. There's a lot of different things that we could be looking at. And of course, when we're looking at these products and packaging within these videos, we're, taking that into consideration and asking ourselves, is it doing the job that it's supposed to be doing?
So let's talk about those jobs at retail and direct to consumer. So first of all, what would the job at retail, what would be some of the key jobs that your packaging would need to do, that silent salesman would need to do at retail?
When you think about the job that your packaging has to do, one of the biggest ones is really selling your product at retail. What this consists of is really communicating the brand integrity, which communicates the quality of the product, what features need to be on there to, communicate clearly, that this is a better product sometimes. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but it's really about looking at the landscape of your product against the competition on the shelves next to you, and making sure that you're communicating the correct attitude and details to make sure your product is selling through.
So one thing that comes to mind with that, like you mentioned when we were talking about Welly, you mentioned, for example, I was like, oh, I think this thing is crazy effective, and then you drilled in some pain points and said, well, hey, if I was an athlete and I wanted to buy something that was waterproof or something that would work for, an extreme sport, you're like, maybe I wouldn't buy this because the features aren't kind of there, So I think it's interesting that effectiveness needs to be, you can't really think about effectiveness without considering where it's being sold, how it's being presented, and the target demographic too. Yeah. Would you say, or is it possible to hit all of that in one thing, or are you going to be a lot more effective if you have those things outlined before you go into design?
I think the most effective packaging really considers all of these different aspects of the product, who the consumer is, where it's selling, and does a good job of communicating these ideas, through creative concepts, essentially. I think like the video we did for Quip, that's a very interesting one because they do a very different way of communicating than most of their competition. It's, much more modern looking and unique packaging, and a little bit more minimal too in terms of the, how things are laid out. But it actually communicates a lot more than most brands because it stands out. And it communicates what it needs to, which is, hey, we are different. So I think, we need to factor in all of those different elements when we're considering its effectiveness. When your product is going direct to consumer versus going to retail, it's going to have a very different job than it would if it were on a retail shelf. If you think about when people interact with your packaging or your product, it's typically after a purchase. So selling the product is not its job. What is its job? Well, it's really kind of to build the value and experience with the customer. So we often talk about the opening experience. This is where it becomes almost critical that when they open it, they are excited about the product, they understand the product, they can, have limited frustrations, and they're, able to just start using it and sharing it. So we're often in our direct-to-consumer packaging much more brand focused, less about all of the features and stuff like that, and building in these almost barriers to the product to create these layers that you're unpeeling and getting excited about, which is almost the opposite of what we do in retail, which is, we're trying to get the product as close to the consumer as possible in its, first contact with the customer.
Let's talk about defendability, our third criteria. What is defendability to you, and what are some markers of a product that has a high defendability score, and then markers of a product that would not have a high defendability score?
Defendability is an attribute that I think is somewhat overlooked and not discussed a lot when other agencies or brands are talking about packaging. It's something that you want to do that really sets yourself apart clearly and is hard for another brand to really come in and compete against you or replicate. A good example of this is one of the brands that we featured is Welly. They've done a really good job with a relatively simple package. They're using this custom molded tin, which puts their brand front and center and really sets themselves apart on a shelf, because everyone else is in a paper box. They're in this tin, and then also just the overall shape, the graphics on it, everything about it really sets itself apart from the competition, and it wouldn't be easy for someone else to really create that. And they've now done such a good job of it. If someone else did that, they'd probably get mistaken for Welly. And, created, in a sense, like put them as somewhat of a Kleenex of their industry, right? Because now they are, known for something that is recognizable even without stating their name.
Yeah, it's like if somebody else copied that tin, not only would you maybe mistake it for Welly, but if you're a discerning customer might look at it and think, oh, this is like the knockoff version, right? It's like, if you went to Oklahoma Roadhouse for a steak, you'd be like, okay, this is like a knockoff Texas Roadhouse, right? It's like you want to make something that's so uniquely your own that anybody else doing something similar, it would feel like they're doing like a Me Too kind of play, yeah?
Yeah. Another thing to think about is how defendability is different than the effectiveness when we talk about that criteria. And they're all somewhat related, of course, but when we think about defendability, what we're judging on is really more about the positioning and not getting into like all the smaller details of all the bits of information that is communicating, but just overall positioning of the product and brand in the marketplace. When we're looking at defendability, one of the tests we often do is we take the packaging and we'll actually cover up the brand on it. If you do that and you can look at the package and you can identify what brand or even product that is, that's a pretty successful package. They've done a really good job in terms of creating a position in the market that's recognizable, regardless of what they're communicating on the package. The overall form and presentation of it is really allowing them to stand out.
Let's talk about the fourth criteria we grade packaging on, and that is execution. What is execution, and what are some markers that you look for that would give a package a high score on execution?
So execution of the packaging is really about, essentially how good of a job they've done in just getting their concept out there and creating it. And this goes back to a little bit of bang for your buck. It's not always about like, how much you spend or how refined it is. We're really taking into consideration their marketplace, their product category, and understanding, how good the packaging is against all of that. Some of the things that we're looking at, obviously, are just the grade of production. How refined is it? What kind of materials are they using? Print quality, things like that. But in addition to that, we're also looking at the overall opening experience as well. Often you see very beautiful packaging. I know I've specifically in consumer electronics, I've had this experience a lot where, it just looks beautiful when I get the packaging. It takes me about 10 minutes to open it because there's so many pieces of tape and cutting and all of this that, the whole experience is kind of ruined a little just because that wasn't really thought through in terms of that opening experience and just making sure that it's done in the most effective way to get the product in the consumer's hands. So there's a lot of little factors we're looking at in addition to just overall kind of grade of material. But then again, just restated, we're also looking at their marketplace and knowing that, for $300 headphone, the experience is probably going to be a little bit different than when you're buying Band-Aids. And the expectation is therefore going to grade how we judge it.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid. I think it's interesting to note too that especially since filming this series, I've noticed every single thing I've opened, and I've noticed products that have nailed it on the high end and products that have nailed it on the low end and products that have missed it in both. So I
Yeah.
think what you mentioned about quality of materials and it really sets the tone. If you open it and you could see that they maybe cut some corners or, it's a cheap piece of paper that was printed or an afterthought, it makes you feel like the whole product is maybe an afterthought, right? Oh, they
Yeah.
didn't have the foresight to think through this. So what else did they cut corners on? One that comes to mind for me that was a really poor execution was we ordered a set of markers recently off of Amazon, and it comes in this case and it was touted as kind of their, frustration-free packaging. It actually shipped in the box. So Amazon put a piece of tape over the top of the box. Well, to open the box, you have to cut the tape, and now you can't use that box to store the markers in. The other thing they did is they have all the markers are stored in foam at the bottom, and it's really hard to get them in there. So it's almost like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, far as concept, they have a really cool idea. They came up with a great idea. They know how to, they said, hey, we're going to make this reusable box that is going to be branded, and Amazon won't need to put it in another carton. But then the
Yeah.
execution was just awful on it, right? So the packaging is not really usable, and we ended up pulling them all out and putting them in a big Ziploc, which kind of kills the whole purpose of it. So it's like their concept might have been, a 9, but the execution was like a 1, which kind of ruined the whole thing.
Using those examples, it kind of tells you how important it is, because it can be a really great concept. It can be a really great product, but you can be left with kind of a bad taste in your mouth because of this,
Yeah.
or it may be a waste of investment. You can look at it that way in terms of from a brand perspective. If you are creating all this really amazing elements and packaging, but the consumer just doesn't feel good about the opening experience, it's kind of a wasted investment. So it's kind of that final mile that kind of allows you to kind of just make sure that everything that you're doing, all your intentions, come across correctly. I think
Yeah.
the classic case study that we reference often, because so many people reference it to us, is Apple, right?
Yeah.
They do such a good job on the execution. Their packaging is relatively simple in some sense. It's essentially just standard boxes, but it's executed so well in every aspect, from the tape they use on it, the shipping cartons that it goes into, how it opens, not too fast or too slow. Like everything's really kind of thought through, and it makes that overall experience really special and memorable, and makes you value the product. So it's just kind of giving a case study of how of a positive impact it can have on your brand and your product.
Okay, let's talk about sustainability, the fifth criteria. Obviously, sustainability is, we're becoming, more and more climate conscious, and we want to be more and more aware of that. Let's talk about the importance of sustainability and then some of the markers we're looking for in grading.
Yeah, sustainability is a bit different than all of the other categories, simply because we're not really focused on how this product is getting in front of the consumer and selling or anything like that. But we see it as an important one simply because it's important to so many of the brands that we're working with. And I think it should just be part of the conversation in general nowadays, because, we're all trying to kind of, see what we can do differently to just, I guess, be better stewards on this earth, right? So however you want to look at it, it's an important factor. Even for your brand, you need to think through, like, what's the impact to the consumers, to my sales, if I choose to or choose not to use sustainable materials or have that as part of my messaging. So that being said, we've included it in here. We think that it's an important part of the discussion now with packaging, because, the truth is packaging creates a lot of waste. So anytime you're creating packaging, just like we talk about, you might as well make sure that you have good communication, good impact on the consumer. If you're going to spend money on packaging, you might as well make sure that you do as much as you can to be sustainable within your packaging, even if it's not a core to your brand. We look at what are we doing within this packaging to make it less wasteful, to better communicate what we can do to be more sustainable, what materials we can use, whatever the case is, I think there's a different reason for every brand, but it's just a part of our day-to-day conversation now in packaging.
Okay, so we've covered bang for your buck, effectiveness, defendability, execution, and sustainability. Now, in our criteria, those scores aren't a 1-for-1 weight. We actually have a different weight assigned to each one of those 5. Let's dive in and talk about that a little bit and why some of those are more important than others. First off, we have effectiveness is weighted the highest, and we have sustainability weighted the lowest. So it's effectiveness is at a 3.5. Let's go through them in order, and let's talk about why we feel like effectiveness is the most important criteria and weighted so much higher above the others.
Effectiveness is, I guess, somewhat of the pinnacle of what we're trying to achieve with the packaging. It really includes a lot of the other aspects that we're talking about and how it brings it all together. So I think that one, really ranks above because it's really, in some sense, a little bit of a summary of how well they did on doing everything in terms of, communicating exactly what they need. Like taking sustainability as an example, a brand that needs to be sustainable is communicating that through the look and their messaging on their packaging. So you can kind of see that it starts to kind of, I guess, do a good job of fitting all the puzzle pieces together and communicating all that correctly to the consumer. And that's why we rank that pretty high.
Effectiveness is also the primary category that's going to affect or drive sales probably the most, right? And so I think as we're looking at our clients, all of our clients have growth goals. They all come in and say, hey, we're shipping X amount of units per month. We want to beat to Y. How do we grow that? With our clients, if we hit the other 4 categories and we missed effectiveness, like it's hard to, even take sustainability. It's hard to make an impact on the planet and feed your employees and, grow your company and do anything good if you're not selling, right? And so it's like really effectiveness and being able to sell and being able to expand your brand, expand your message is probably one of the biggest things that if we missed that for a client, we would feel like we really dropped the ball.
Yeah. I think that's one of the few ways that you can really judge the success of packaging as well from a brand perspective. Again, going back to how we started this, the reason we came up with all this criteria is because anyone can have an opinion about packaging they like, but it's really hard to say what product packaging is better than another. Looking at how well the packaging does in terms of improving the communication and sales of the product is one that you can almost attach an ROI to, and that's why it's so important.
Yeah.
So as we looked at the different categories, one idea was just to kind of weigh them equally. But the truth of the matter is, most brands aren't looking at them equally. And every brand's going to have, different criteria and reason for putting one above the other. So what we did is we tried to just kind of understand what most brands need and what's most important to them. To us, effectiveness was a really important one because we're not just talking about how good the packaging looks or how sustainable is it, but overall, how good is it doing in terms of really helping the product sell, which ultimately is what's going to make the brand succeed or not. So that's why that one is ranked higher than some others. And, we've tried to do our best to kind of rank these and weight them based off of how it is important to most clientele.
I think to add on to that, customers perceive them differently as well, right? So for example, you're not going to look, unless you're buying a product like Patagonia or, maybe there are certain times when sustainability, is one of the driving factors. But I would even argue that has really permeated the rest of their brand. And so you're not buying Patagonia because they're a sustainable company per se. It's almost like you have to focus on what's going to get the attention of the consumer first, mm-hmm. right? And then you go down and you check off those boxes. So I think there would be a reality where a customer might look at it and think, hey, I love this, but, geez, I'm not going to support a company that does X, Y, Z, but they're probably not coming into the product looking at, the execution or looking at sustainability first. So I think that weighting almost kind of, I love that it speaks to the brand, and then it also speaks to how the customer is going to perceive that product, whether on the shelf.
I agree with that.
Okay, last thing I want to cover, Bryan, we talked about why we're doing this series. We went through the different criteria that we use to grade. We talked about the weights on those criteria and why we value some higher than others. Last thing is, the internet and YouTube is full of people that just have random opinions about things. So let's talk a little bit about your background, about what process is done, and speak to the fact that, we're not just a couple of guys that have an opinion about boxes, and there's some expertise there, right? So maybe just take a second and share some of the background of process so that people can understand, the expertise that we have as we're looking at grading these different products.
Absolutely. Process has a long history in packaging, both from the design perspective as well as the manufacturing. That's what makes us unique against, most other companies, actually, is that we are able to kind of speak to with a deep level of experience on both sides of it. So we're not just presenting ideas that aren't executable, but we're not manufacturers who are just, doing the bare minimum just to get your product protected and not thinking through how it's going to sell. So that being said, this was a great way for us to kind of, talk about all of these categories, which, we've been doing these videos for a while where we've been, really dissecting the different packaging. And we just wanted to go a little bit further and kind of open up the conversation and get people to start thinking about, really what does make good packaging. And I think that for us, it's just fun, but also, something we are genuinely passionate about and kind of want to dissect with people.
Yeah, and maybe speak to some of the. I'm gonna force you to name drop a little bit and do some stats and results. I know that's kind of not your ethos, but just so the viewer can understand, some of the brands that we've worked with, things like that. Run through some of the logos and some of the brands that we've worked with.
Yeah, we've had great opportunities with some really great brands in terms of developing their packaging and helping them kind of navigate these different criteria. This goes everywhere from Skull Candy, Nixon, The Honest Company, Adidas. And with each of them, it's a different focus and different way to look at these different criteria or, needs for their current project and everything. But regardless, we're always looking at all of these criteria and trying to make sure that we're addressing each of them as we think through the actual packaging.
Okay, and then I want to ask you an impossible question, just so the viewer can understand the scale. How many different pieces of packaging do you think Process has ran through in the last 10 years or so? I mean, I could see 200 on the shelf behind you.
It's that I don't think I've ever counted.
But thousands, right?
Yeah,
Multiple thousands.
I would say, we have worked with hundreds of brands on literally thousands of products. And, for each of those, we're producing tens to hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of units of packaging each time. So we know the importance of getting it right before you really go to production, because once it's done, it goes up on a shelf. It's not like a website where you can go in and change it later. The stuff that you put on a shelf is on a shelf sometimes for, months or years, depending on the type of product it is. And so, we really kind of do it as best we can to get things right, not just in terms of the execution, but the actual thought behind it and making sure that it's doing its job.